Hello, Biology World. The purpose of this video is to give students who are absent on Tuesday, or who just simply weren't keeping up, an opportunity to finish up the notes. Very likely you will be finishing these notes on the asynchronous Wednesday. But today we're getting into section 16-3, where it starts talking about how new species evolve from old common ancestors. And without further ado, here we go. Please remember the 16-2 notes. It stopped at number 13. Therefore, we are starting with number 14. And of course, class notes are always in Cornell note style, and they need to be numbered. All right, here we go. All right, so speciation, we're going to abbreviate that because you're going to see that word a lot in these notes. So please abbreviate it as capital S, capital P. Remember, NS stands for natural selection. So we talked about natural selection acting on organisms that have disadvantages or don't have the advantages. Remember, we talked about genetic drift and random increases in allele frequencies that wouldn't necessarily be expected based on the type of organism, on the characteristics they have, but those lead to the changes in the relative frequencies of the alleles or the characteristics or the traits. Remember, we use those kind of interchangeably in a population, and that leads to speciation. Also, please remember, I'm going to be going a lot faster than I normally do when I'm lecturing in class because this is a video, and of course you can pause the video if I'm going too fast. All right, so definitions. Species, speciation. Speciation is basically that. It's the process of creating a new species, not creating a new species. The process of a new species evolving is the best way to say that. And of course, a species is a group of organisms that breed with one another and they can produce fertile offspring. And that fertile offspring is really, really important because a horse and a donkey can breed. They can even produce offspring, which is called a mule. But that mule doesn't have the right number of chromosomes, and that mule itself cannot have its own offspring. So it is infertile. So if a mule itself could have its own offspring, then the horse and the donkey would be considered the same species. But because they produce offspring that is infertile, they are different species. All right, remember, when I'm getting ready to move ahead, I will point at the camera. Of course, if you are muting me, that is your direction to either pause the video if I'm going too fast. And here we go. All right, so factors involved in speciation. So you got to separate the gene pools. Remember, the gene pools is the collection of all of the genes in that population. So if you separate them and they can no longer mix, then they're going to be able to evolve on their own. As new species evolve, populations become reproductively isolated. That basically means the gene pools are separated. There will be no interactions between the members of those populations in terms of reproduction or breeding or mating. But you got to separate the gene pools for that to happen, for that to begin to happen. We're going to abbreviate reproductively isolated or reproductive isolation as capital R, capital I. How do you know when reproductive isolation has taken place? Well, when the members of the two populations can't interbreed. So let's just say these two populations get separated for, a couple hundred, couple thousand generations. And then they decide to migrate and they come across one another. It's like, hey, you look kind of familiar. And it's mating season, so let's give it a shot. Okay, so when they mate and they produce offspring, if they produce offspring at all, that offspring itself can't produce offspring. Okay, so that offspring would kind of like be a hybrid, I guess is a way to look at it. Characteristics of both parents. And if that offspring itself can't reproduce on its own, then speciation has taken place, meaning this species A and this species B are different enough to where they can't produce fertile offspring. We know that the gene pools have been separated long enough for speciation to have taken place, or reproductive isolation to have isolated them long enough for speciation to have taken place. Moving ahead. All right, how can reproductive isolation occur? There's three ways. Behavioral isolation, abbreviating it Geographic isolation, abbreviating it. Temporal isolation, abbreviating it. So behavior, which we'll get into a second, means that there's some behavior that those organisms do that let other organisms know we're not the same species. Geographic isolation is exactly what it states, meaning that they are separated by some geographic structure or an ocean or something like that. We'll get into that a little bit. And then temporal stands for time. So we're talking about maybe different organisms that breed and mate at different times of the year, and that's how the gene pools get separated. So these all are methods that are involved in separating the gene pools somehow, okay, and allowing for species to evolve on their own. So behavioral. They could breed, but the behaviors that cause breeding to not occur, like a mating ritual or a mating dance, different bird calls, reptiles, especially frogs, pardon me, frogs aren't reptiles, they're amphibians, have a certain sound of their voice, lets others of other species know that they're not to reproduce, not to mate. Different smells, they're called pheromones. I didn't choose to put that in there, but a pheromone is basically a scent or a chemical that an organism puts out when it's ready to breed. And if the chemical's not recognized by a different species, obviously, it's not going to pursue that mating opportunity. Geographic isolation, separated by geographic barriers like a river. Obviously, a river, probably not that big of a deal for like an alligator or something like that. But if we're talking about an insect that can't fly, even a small stream, small creek, even a couple feet wide, might prevent it from getting to the other side. Mountain ranges are good ones, especially for organisms that can't handle less concentration of oxygen at altitude or can't handle the cold associated with that. They're staying on this side of the mountain, they stay on this side of the mountain. Canyon is another one. There's a great example of squirrels that got separated by the Grand Canyon. And of course, the Grand Canyon formed long, long ago. And now those squirrel species are so different that even if they did try to mate, they probably couldn't produce an offspring. And if they did produce an offspring, it would be an infertile offspring, meaning speciation has taken place. Moving ahead. Okay, please use this as an opportunity to practice with your notes. Every minute you spend practicing with your notes now is a minute you don't have to spend reviewing them to get ready for the test. Blank is the formation of a new species, and blank is a group of blanks that breed with one another and produce blank offspring. These are two definitions. Take a look back at number 15. Yeah, so speciation is the formation of a new species, and a species is a group of organisms or individuals that breed with one another and produce fertile offspring, or offspring that themselves can have their own offspring. What must be separated between two populations in order for them to become different species? You might want to take a look at number 16. Yeah, you got to separate the gene pools. You got to separate the genes. You got to separate the DNA. I mean, at the molecular level, really, you got to separate the sperm and the eggs from the two populations to make sure that no fertilization can take place. And as long as no fertilization can take place and you're not going to be mixing those gene pools, then each individual population has the opportunity to evolve on its own due to natural selection pressures, mating opportunities, genetic drift, if we want to throw some randomness in there. But yeah, you got to separate the gene pools and not let them mix if you are going to have speciation occur on both. What three types of isolation allow for speciation to take place? What are the three types of isolation that lead to reproductive isolation? What's the one where you got like a geographic barrier? Geographic isolation. What's the one where you have like a different mating ritual? Yeah, that's behavioral. What's the one where you have like they're mating at different periods of time? Yeah, you got it. That's temporal. Okay, what are the two types of barriers? What are two types of barriers that can lead to geographic isolation? Take a look back at number 20. All right, so it's like a river, it's like a canyon, could be like a forest, could be mountains, could be an ocean, obviously. Yeah. Okay, so the Galapagos Island speciation, how did that take place? I did cut out temporal isolation or temporal isolation. There are many small bird species that mate during very specific times of the year. And that's when they're making their calls, that's when they're releasing their pheromones, et cetera, et cetera. So temporal isolation is simply different organisms that mate or reproduce at different times of the year. And obviously, if one is not mating at that time, it's not going to be interested. Okay, so the Galapagos Island. So a founding of a new population. So like I'd said before, probably was a storm where at least one male and one female got blown off course. And when the storm cleared and they were over the ocean somewhere, they were tired and they were hungry and they found these islands and they landed and they're like, wow, there's not a whole lot of competition on these islands. We're going to stick around. And honestly, they might not have known how to get back. Many species do have these things in their head that can read the magnetic poles of the Earth, and that kind of directs them on where to go. But those are really only for species that migrate long distances. So it's very possible that these guys would have never been able to find their way back. Founding of a new population on the Galapagos, and then you had geographic isolation. Okay, so obviously we had geographic isolation from the South American mainland, and then between the islands there was even some geographic isolation, even though these birds can fly from one place to the next. Then you had changes in the new population's gene pools because those gene pools got separated, which leads to reproductive isolation. Remember, reproductive isolation is even though these two birds could get back together and then try to reproduce, enough change has happened that they're new species. And then you have ecological competition, which we're going to abbreviate as capital E, capital C. Each ecological competition leads to natural selection pressures favoring organisms with adaptations or characteristics that give them an advantage. So these are all of the steps necessary that led to the 13 distinct species in the Galapagos, which started with that one common ancestor, the common ground finch, which was in South America. All right, so step one, the founding population arrives. Species A travels from South America to the Galapagos Islands, and then they decide to stay, and they survive and reproduce. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to use this as an opportunity to make a slight change here. I wasn't aware of how much of this image would be covered by me. We're good now. Better. Okay. All right. Moving ahead. All right, so step two, geographic isolation occurs. Some species A birds go to a new island, and then the gene pools are separated. Step three, you get changes in the gene pool. So the different selection pressures on these different islands favor certain organisms within the population that have characteristics. And then over hundreds or thousands of generations, eventually these birds are going to change over time and adapt to this new environment. Whereas species A, they've already adapted to that environment, but maybe they have some changes in their habitat there that cause certain organisms to survive and reproduce. So anyway, now that these gene pools are separated, the natural selection pressures in these two different environments start to work on the gene pool and to select the genes for advantageous characteristics and not select the genes for disadvantage or disadvantageous characteristics, or simply characteristics that don't give them an advantage. So the second island favor birds with large beaks. So drier climates or climates that are experiencing drought, the plant species will produce seeds that are hardier and tougher, basically to allow for less evaporation and give the seed a greater chance of surviving until water comes back. So that favors birds with large, robust beaks, whereas smaller beaks are more for fleshy seeds or fruits, of the plants. Step 4, population on the second island evolves into population B. Now you can see it's got a larger beak. It's kind of different in color. All right, moving ahead. Step 5, reproductive isolation occurs. If population B birds happen to go back to the first island and try to mate with birds A, it's not going to work because the gene pools have been separated for so long and speciation has taken place. They will not mate with birds from population A. Probably not. But if they tried, enough evolution has taken place in species B and possibly in species A. It kind of depends on whether or not that island actually changed a whole lot to not allow for the production of fertile offspring. And then we know that speciation has taken place. And there's one more step in this process, and that is ecological competition. Evolution continues as species A and B compete for available seeds on the first island. Again, this is, of course, assuming that species B comes back to the first island. And if indeed there are enough differences on that island to allow for certain adaptations to give certain birds an advantage, you might get a new species C on that first island. And of course, now if this were all to happen, that means we have 3 distinct species. And of course, we now have 13 species on those islands. So obviously, this type of thing happened a lot over thousands and thousands and thousands of generations. All right, moving ahead. All right, so you get continued evolution, the process of reproductive isolation, genetic change, process of isolation, geographic isolation, genetic change, and reproductive isolation happened across the entire Galapagos Island chain, and that led to 13 distinct species. Is there evidence? Yeah. They descended with modification. Again, you hear that term a lot in the Darwin movie. Descent means come from. Modification means there are changes that are occurring. So descended with modification from a common ancestor from South America, and that would be the common ground finch. All right, moving ahead. Hi, what were the 5 things that happened to cause speciation of the finches on the Galapagos Islands? You might want to take a look back at number 21. So what do we got? We got founding of a new population, okay, on the Galapagos. Geographic isolation, hopping to a different island. Changes in the new population's gene pools, because those gene pools are separated. Reproductive isolation has then taken place. Even if they tried to reproduce back on that first island, they're different enough to not produce fertile offspring, if they produce any offspring at all. And then, of course, ecological competition. So those are the 5 steps, and you're going to need to remember those 5 steps for the test. Changes in the blank blank occurred in seed sizes on the second island blanked birds with large beaks. You might want to take a look back at number 23, 24. Yeah, so changes in the gene pool occurred, and the seed sizes on the second island favored or selected birds with large beaks. After population B was created, could they interbreed with population A? So if they came back to that island and tried to reproduce with population A, would it have worked? Might want to take a look at number 26, 27. Yeah, no. So they might try to breed, And if they do happen to produce offspring, that offspring itself would be infertile. So speciation has taken place after this long period of time. Population C develops because of the competition between blank and blank. Take a look at number 27. Yeah, so you get a population C because of the competition between the original population A and then the newly developed population B. When two species do not reproduce because of the differences in mating rituals, the situation is referred to as temporal, geographic, behavioral, or reproductive. Yeah, so a sort of a ritual or a song or an action, that's a behavior. All of the following played a role in speciation of the Galapagos finches, except which one of those is not part of speciation with the finches? No changes in the gene pool, separation of the populations, reproductive isolation, natural selection. Which one is not a characteristic of finches? Yeah, it's no changes in the gene pool. There was a change in the gene pool. There were changes in the gene pool. Is the correct way to say that. Beak size in the various groups of Galapagos finches changed primarily in response to climate, mating preference, food source, availability of water. Why did birds evolve different shaped and sized beaks? It was based on the food source. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the notes. We will see you in class or see you in the Zoom.